Hello, my name is John Griffiths with film number 4 in the series of using technology to support preaching. And I want to use this film to talk about some specific issues or ways in which you might want to use PowerPoint slides as part of a sermon. If you want to find out more about that, look at the earlier films in the series. But here's principle number 1. The usefulness of using ordinary objects. Here's a post-it note. And it doesn't take long to either put it on a scanner if you've got one, or if you want to, you can photograph it and drop it in. Here's a second example from a sermon where I was encouraging people to get rid of rubbish that's in their lives. Well, if you want to dramatise that, easiest thing in the world is simply to go outside and photograph your dustbin, which is exactly what I did. It doesn't take very long, and it's, I think, quite impactful. This next principle is about using real people, and I mentioned this briefly in the last film. I think we have a unique opportunity to make the communities we live in and the congregations that we preach to part of the sermons, and that needs a little bit of preparation, but not that much. This image and the next one came from a sermon I preached where the night before there'd been a fancy dress party in the church hall. And so what I did was to take a whole lot of photos, not particularly good quality, and then to get up very early on the Sunday morning and to put these into a PowerPoint with very simple captions. It took hardly any time to do, but because the theme was about the church as a community, I think it's very powerful. This particular image of a grandmother, Bev, and her granddaughter, I think it's just a lovely, lovely image. You'll have seen that I haven't even had time to get rid of the red eye from Bev's eyes, but it still works. Here's another one from the same one. So people dressed up in a crazy way, but hopefully it makes the point about community far more than even words can. This next 2 or 3 images came from a sermon about Jesus' parable about the bridesmaids. My way of doing this was to ask the women in the church to, if they had been bridesmaids, and if they had, and about half of them had, to give me their photos, which I then scanned in and used as part of the sermon. And it was a very powerful way of reinforcing that Jesus' invitation is for us all to be in his wedding party. And so again, these are images of real people who were there in the congregation, and half the fun, of course, was the congregation trying to work out who they were. I'm going to move on to the next point number 3, which is about the use of creative type. There's so many fonts, there's so many ways of doing things in the on the computer, then why not actually do something a bit more dramatic? So here's an example where all you need to do is to take your headline and then to copy and paste it a number of different times. Here's another one to dramatise the point, your Jesus is too small, where all I'm doing is to take the type, copy it, and then make the font bigger. This next one is about how to use quotations. And because you have within the auto shapes in PowerPoint quotation bubbles that you can put text into, it's a very simple way of doing it, and it allows you to put a picture or something else from the person who's doing the quotation. Here's a rather informal way of dealing with Jesus' baptism, which is a bit unexpected, but I hope you'll agree that it's quite impactful. I move on to item number 5, which is statistics. Now, it's very easy to make statistics boring. Here is a way to dramatise them, because I was trying to explain that the average Anglican in 2010 is Nigerian. I simply used as the simple fact and a picture. And again, to remind ourselves that by 2020, the average Christian in the world will be Chinese. Again, a simple way to dramatise that. This next slide was a way of showing that 2009 was a very special year when, for the first time, more people lived in cities than out of them. And I've chosen to juxtapose quite a religious image of the heavenly city, Jerusalem, with a very earthly city, a favela from Brazil. Here's one which came from a sermon about Advent, and was asking the question, where is he? Now, I could have done that just as a very simple statistic, but hopefully you could see that I'm using statistics quite emotionally. I was using the Black Death, I was using Rwanda and the killing fields to ask the question, how long before the Lord returns? I then move on to maps and models. If I'm trying to explain about history, it would be very easy to overwhelm people with detail. So I've simply chosen and made a little winding road with 3 images and 3 dates, so I can make my point quickly without losing too much time. Here's another one which came from a sermon about Cornelius and Peter's preaching to him, and Cornelius, the first Gentile, coming to faith, and reminding ourselves with a map that there was 2 churches. One which responded by sending missionaries out to preach the Christian faith to the Gentiles, and the Jerusalem church which gave permission but did nothing itself. And it's a very simple and dramatic way of doing that. Here's one which comes from the bridesmaids' sermon again, and because we need to remind ourselves that the Bible is an Asian book, what I did was to in effect draw a map to explain the differences in an Asian wedding in a way which hopefully explains it to people, but also takes us out of a kind of Western worldview. And this schematic is just a reminder where I've somehow managed to juxtapose Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel with Alpha. Again, you can use arrows in PowerPoint very easily, and it's just a very simple way of being able to convey an idea about mission, God reaching out, and evangelism, answering the questions. And this one is quite elaborate. It was from the sermon about Peter and Cornelius, and it was to show that there are lots of stories about Peter in the New Testament and where this particular one fits in Peter's journey. And what I'm doing here is to juxtapose John Drain's account of the different stages that Peter went through with James Fowler's stages of faith. And again, it's often simpler to be able to show a visual like this and to talk it through quickly rather than just try and do it with words alone. Then number 7, annotations. This is something where I photocopied bits of liturgy from the Church of England website and then got children to explain them. And by scanning these and then putting them into slides, hopefully that conveys much more impactfully and almost emotionally a child's view of the words which are so familiar to us. If you haven't got time to get the handwriting and the scanning, then all you need to do is to choose a more informal handwritten style font and to use text boxes to kind of annotate the more formal text if you want to do that. I want to finish just by talking about some stronger images that we can use, because I know that some people can be concerned that the images become so strong that they distract. Remember, you always have an off switch on a good clicker, so that if you want, you can just switch the image off while you're then talking about it. But if you're going to talk about baddies, for example, and this was from the Sermon on the Good Shepherd, then why not use a baddie like Preston, the famous robo-dog, who was an opponent for Wallace and Gromit to overcome as he rustled sheep. This was from a sermon about the celebrity, mostly from Colossians, but I went to Ephesians to talk about the church being the body beautiful. Now, instead of using often very abstract images of a body, why not talk about the body being toned and fit and not simply coordinated? But also within the same sermon, where we had also handed out to people as they came in Heat magazine so that people could pick their favourite celebrity. It was a way to remind ourselves that even though we have a view of fame and heroism which is rooted in celebrity in our culture, that Jesus is no celebrity, that he had no beauty that we should look on him, to quote from Isaiah 52 and 53. And so therefore I've chosen to use art which portrays Jesus in a very different light. And again, this is something which you can do beautifully using visuals, which words would struggle to convey unless you were to move into something like poetry. Just to remind ourselves also that the internet is full of gorgeous pictures of babies that make people laugh and get them involved. So I will do this from time to time. It's a great technique, and there's lots of this sort of material. And this last one here is it's a technique called an animated GIF, which is a particular graphic format. the way you do it is by taking 2 or 3 images which are quite similar and then putting them on each other as an animated GIF, and then they cycle. It might look elaborate. It's a simple form of animation which you can do with a graphics package, and it probably took me 5 minutes to throw together. So again, the idea is to take a simple idea and not using too much time to have a fairly elaborate effect. Now, that's all I've got time to talk about in this film. I hope this has given you an impression of the opportunity that we have to use words and pictures to engage people. I think the point here is that we need to engage with people's imagination, and we need to engage with people's emotions. But that isn't the end point. The whole point about this is for us to be engaging with people's will and encouraging them to a change of life and lifestyle. Eugene Peterson has said, somewhat controversially, that the job of a preacher is to subvert the congregation, and Walter Brueggelmann talks about the preacher as a poet, to say things in a way that almost can't be said in other ways. And I'm hoping that this has given you some ideas in which you can go and do that. Thank you very much for listening. In the next film I'm going to be talking about how we use interviews and vox pops as part of sermons. Bye for now.